Hello, guys, and welcome to episode 2, guest episode 2 of my podcast, Arnstein's POV. We are joined today by Dr. Dean St. Mark, who has a PhD in organic chemistry, a background in drug design and pharmacology, and we are going to be discussing peptides and supplements for health performance around the age of 40. So, thank you very much for joining us, Dean, and can you give us a brief introduction about yourself, mate?
Thank you very much, Aaron, for inviting me on. So, as you've said, my name's Dr. Dean St. Mark. I am the formulator and part owner of Supplement Needs, a UK-based supplement company. We started out in 2018 with our own supplement line, which really developed from the need to produce supplements that had full transparency, were properly dosed to the highest quality. I just had enough looking at other competitors out there that were pretty much ripping people off with hidden blends and not dosing things right. So ever since 2018, we've grown force on force within the UK and global market as a company that just stands for the ethics of putting people's health first and foremost. So I'm very happy to have been invited on to discuss supplements and therapeutic peptides that we can use to improve people's overall health, well-being, quality of life, with minor changes, I guess, to their lifestyle and their nutrition, that these things then help to supplement on top of those dietary changes. I think when people look at supplements and these peptides that are becoming more and more widespreadly available, they think that these are almost like medications that are coming in to serve the purpose of removing symptoms and expecting to see huge gain of benefit from taking these things, when, to be honest, a dietary supplement or even the likes of the peptides we can discuss are really there to supplement your lifestyle, your environment, how you live your life day to day, rather than thinking, if I take this supplement, I'm going to be protected against heart disease, or I'm going to be protected against blood pressure or diabetes. That they're really just a useful, I guess, supplement to how you've implemented dietary changes through like someone like yourself, that if you're not getting enough fruits and vegetables perhaps into your diet, then you might take advantage of a supplement that has antioxidants, polyphenols, stuff with clinical evidence that help to support overall general well-being. So I got introduced to the bodybuilding and fitness community back in 2017. So I've been online educating since my wife pushed me online in 2017. And before that, I was a kickboxer, a high-level goalkeeper, and as a consequence of a foot injury with kickboxing, I got very interested in bodybuilding. I was using bodybuilding to like supplement strength gains for kickboxing. And with the injury, it just forced me to pick a new challenge or a new hobby to get into. And it was just with entering into bodybuilding, obviously as a 20, 21-year-old, you're a little naive to the world of bodybuilding in terms of natural and what is probably now becoming widely well known of the enhanced culture of bodybuilding as well. But at that age, you don't really see that enhanced side. You're a little naive. Well, back then, obviously, this was 15, 16 years ago, when there was no public social media. You had, strength and fitness magazines where everything was very taboo. And really you were forced to understand nutrition, how different supplements would work, whether it's creatine, electrolytes, amino acids. But as time went on, and obviously applying what I learned in my degree, you start to see the other side to bodybuilding, whether that is different performance enhancing compounds or drugs, if you want to call them. Of that, the peptides and other different types of supplements play into that performance enhancing aspect. So taking the sort of aspect of my education of developing drugs towards symptoms, I became very interested in like naturopathy or functional medicine, of asking the question, well, why do you have the problem? Like if someone has type 2 diabetes, why do they have type 2 diabetes? Is it genetic? Is it lifestyle induced in terms of eating too many carbohydrates? Is it medication induced? Are they taking stuff that has sped up the development of pancreatic insufficiency. All these little things of asking the questions why and then working back to the how do you address those root causes. And that was where I became very interested in supplements. So
Yeah.
I'm an open book to where we go in the conversation, but it's always been important to me.
That's kind of some of the stuff you mentioned yourself is very similar to my interests in the space, if you like. Like, I became a nutritionist because, for two reasons really. I'm fascinated with the link between diet and disease, and I am also fascinated by, like, people's ability to really push the envelope of physical capabilities, whether that be extreme endurance or whether that be extreme strength and gaining muscle, or somewhere in the middle where the people mix up both. I'm kind of interested in all that from a performance and hobby standpoint, and the health side of stuff from a career standpoint. And I kind of, like you touched on, the diabetes for the genetic factor there. Like, I found out at uni, my mum had gestational diabetes with me when she was pregnant with me, and when I was studying, I found on that, like, she's passed on the gene basically to me, and I'm 6 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, more likely to have a higher birth weight, more likely to have a higher appetite and BMI throughout life. I've ticked all the boxes. So it's crazy that things like that could actually follow you genetically from day one. And I've had spells that not really been the best, but I've always sort of seen myself as, like, people say carb sensitive, but I genuinely feel I always have been that way. And then when finding out sort of genetically that I'm predisposed to be quite insulin resistant anyway, I was like a aha moment sort of thing. I was like, that's probably been the reason that I do better on low carb diets. It's probably been since I was a child. I've had that just genetic predisposition to be sort of slightly insulin resistant.
Yeah, I mean, even the new thing that's hopefully coming in the next 8 to 10 years of personalized medicine, of knowing your genetics, like what you touched on there. And this is sort of a very interesting point, because like that with the gestational diabetes being passed on in terms of the genetics, when we look at, utilizing certain compounds, whether they are medicines, whether they are performance enhancing compounds, in terms of your genetics, some of these things work at a genetic level of switching on and off different genes. And obviously, we have what's called epigenetics, where it's the influence of the environment on your genes. So just because you have a gene for type 2 diabetic susceptibility, it doesn't mean that gene is currently switched on. That can obviously come as a consequence of the environment. And I mean, I'm speaking from experience, because 2 years ago I was diagnosed celiac, and looking at my genetics, I had the genes for HLA-DQ, which is what makes your immune system switch on, and they were only switched on in my late 30s from something in the environment. So when you have that genetic risk, it doesn't necessarily mean that the genes are being expressed, but it is useful to know then that you have those genetics, because when you then have a child, your epigenetics of how they are expressed is potentially passed to your child as well. So if that gene is switched on, the gene might be switched on in your child as well. And even, like, for example, higher rates of testosterone, whether that is natural or enhanced or therapeutically enhanced, if a male has a higher level of testosterone, what's to say then from a genetic perspective that you're not passing that expression of what's happening in the genetics to the child as well? And you might see a link, like, this is something that I've become quite interested in, is the link between, elite sports athletes and then obviously the epigenetics or the progeny genetics of where you see familial high level athletes filter through, because of potentially you have that genetic or epigenetics being passed on.
Then it becomes a question of nature or nurture sort of thing. Is it the environment, or were they born like that? Yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously, if, for example, if you have something like a professional bodybuilder who has a very high level of testosterone, and then they have a child, and the epigenetics of that high level bodybuilder are towards increased muscle mass, increased strength, etc. Well, is there a question there that naturally you've then passed these genes on to your child, and then that child has a kick start or a head start in life as a very athletic person, to speak. Again, based on a nurture, that if you nurture their strength, you nurture their skeletal growth, their muscle growth, that they've already been given a head start with their genetics being switched on, which, you know, is a whole fascinating thing to think about.
Yeah, stuff like that does fascinate me as well. See, like you mentioned, your celiac. Do you think there's a possibility that that could have been aggravated by maybe overuse of oats and stuff throughout your bodybuilding career?
So I think,
well, overuse of grains in general.
What I think happened with me was I was exposed to toxic molds years ago. And toxic mold, if you have exposure to toxic mold and you have the HLA DQ genetics, you end up with the mold toxicity. And then as a consequence, the mold toxicity can punch holes in your gut. So obviously start making more zonulin. And then, like you said there, probably exposure to high carbohydrates. So all my career, my bodybuilding career to speak, I was eating relatively low gluten in terms of like rice, oats, corn-based foods. But from like the age of 30, 31, I had bowel problems that I just could not put my finger on. And for a long time, my wife was saying, there is something wrong with your gut. And I just probably, wrote it off as eating a lot of foods. Like, I mean, at my peak, I was eating 700, 800 grams of carbs per day, which was like, 200, 250 grams of oats would have been a normal meal with the high fiber and everything else. You're just trying to question what's going on. And how it was caught with me was pure serendipity. I had a blood test done and my total cholesterol came back at 9. And I looked at the results and I said to my wife, like, that has to be completely wrong. And she said to me, like, that is very strange. Like, I had no symptoms, nothing whatsoever. Went back, had another blood test, same results. And that's when I thought, okay, something's not right here, because my total cholesterol would normally never be any higher than 3.8 or even 4. So with the high cholesterol, and of that cholesterol being all LDL and triglycerides, eventually we worked our way down to doing a celiac test, a transglutaminase IgA test. Sure enough, the antibodies were sky high. And what had happened was, in the past, whenever I had blood work done, because I rarely ate gluten, you wouldn't catch it on a blood test, that inflammatory response. And by chance, when I had my blood work done when my cholesterol was very high, I had been eating a lot of bread and eggs, with being ill with a flu prior to that blood test. And so all the bread consumption had triggered off the response internally at the liver. But then it all made sense in hindsight when you go backwards, and you're like, there's periods where I always felt very, very tired, both mentally and physically. I had brain fog, all these things that you're really just pushing to the side and ignoring, and then you get your aha moment of, okay, this all makes sense now.
Yeah, like maybe cheat meals of pizza and burger and chips or whatever, and then you're like floored for 2 days.
So that's what happened when I competed in 2022, for the second last time. I retired after 2022, and then I went back last year to compete. In 2022, I was gluten-free for pretty much all my prep. It was all rice-based foods. And then when it came to carbing up for like my first sort of test show that season, we put in Rice Krispies, Cocoa Pops, and some bagels. And I swear my stomach swelled out to the size of a big giant watermelon. The gas production, the pain. And at the time, again, we just thought it was post-viral IBS. We had one of the notorious bugs that goes around when you have kids.
Yeah.
We all got affected with it. And quite often, if you get gastroenteritis, you're going to be very sensitive to sugar with post-viral IBS. So I just put it down to that excruciating agony for like 24 hours. I just went back to eating rice for the next meals of carbing up. And then, sure enough, everything died down. But again, it went back that, the barley malt extract and the Rice Krispies and Cocoa Pops, the bagel, just set off an immune response where for so long my body had sort of settled itself in inflammation from gluten removal. And then when we had the actual diagnosis, I'd been gluten-free again for 16 weeks and had a trace exposure from a meal we had out. And again, I was in agony for 3 days after that. And a funny thing when you mentioned, I was going to say about oats, when I was diagnosed celiac, I had a bit of naivety again surrounding grains and prolamins and the gluten particles within different grains. And I had a good friend who is celiac. She said to me, oats, you won't ever be able to eat oats because they have a venin, and a venin cross reacts with gliadin and wheat. And I was sort of writing her off, like, yeah, I don't think so. I'm going to keep eating oats, gluten-free oats, which is a complete misnomer if you're listening to the podcast, because gluten-free oats means there's no contamination with wheat. They still have gluten in them.
Yeah.
And for a period of time, my bowel, it was pretty much fully recovered, but I have the odd time where it wasn't right. And it was only when I eliminated oats and oat milk completely that everything went to perfect, perfect bowel health. That it's funny when people think they're eating healthily surrounding oats, and then they don't realize that if there is some gut problems, that some of that venin can get into the bloodstream and trigger off inflammation.
Yeah, I think I have issues with oats as well. I don't really eat any oats at all now, but years ago, I've never been able to make oats with water or oats with just whey. It's got to have a milk product in it. If I make it with just water, I get vicious indigestion. So I eventually just stopped eating them. But like what you're saying about the celiac, I don't think people realise that. The acronym is BRAL. So the things you've got to avoid is barley, rice, oats and wheat. Whereas a lot of people, unless they're diagnosed and unless they've had the information, they'll just avoid wheat and think it's bread and pasta. So many other, and cross-contamination, like you mentioned as well. It's meant to be a painful thing too when it starts, is it?
Yeah, I mean that so the competing one, I put a video of it on my Instagram story when it happened during that prep, and people were like, "Wow, that looks painful." The second time, when I had the exposure, I was in bed for 2 days, and because I'd been strict gluten free for so long, I mean, not even trace gluten after the diagnosis. The best way I could describe it is like sheets of sandpaper running along your gut, and the lethargy. I just stayed in bed for 2 days. I was completely wrote off that. Now, I remember when I got the diagnosis, I had said to my wife, I don't want to be one of these people that's in a restaurant going like, oh, is this in it? And is this in it? And is this in it? And after that exposure, you're sort of trying to not be a burden when you go out to eat, but then you're thinking like, if I get a trace exposure, even minute, you're going to be in agony for days that you end up having to be this awkward guy that's like, I can't have this, and this. Can you make sure that, or within reason, please make sure there's no contamination?
Yeah, you probably ended up with a heightened immune response as well because you'd eliminated it for so long as well. So when you did get that slight exposure, whereas before you would been exposing yourself more often, so it wouldn't be as severe, and then that's probably been like, no, you cannot eat this.
And that was why then when I cut out the oats, this was like summer 2023. So I was diagnosed March 23. Summer 2023 was when I sort of said, right, I need to probably fix my gut in terms of there's clearly gut inflammation, leaky gut. When I looked at my blood work, I could see that aspect that, for so long you're looking at it and you're going, it's telling me hints, but it's only when you start lining everything up that you go, okay, now I have a very good understanding that the gut isn't happy with me. And that was where back in like 2010, 2011, as a student during my PhD, I got very interested in the synthesis of peptides, all the different peptide research that was coming out, like mainstream online. I mean, peptides have been around for 20, 30 years before that. It was just they were becoming a lot more mainstream at the internet and online forums at that point, and social media. I took a good interest to go back and look at therapeutic peptides that might be useful for healing my gut. And that was where I looked into oral BPC 157, which again is a big mainstream thing that everyone seems to be being exposed to online, where it's ads, influencers, or whatever else. And then the other peptide that was useful was lorazepatide, which another good friend of mine, Mark, basically made me aware about the research on it because I'd never heard of it. And
I've never heard of that either.
When I started looking at it, it was basically trialed in phase 2 clinical trials and human clinical trials for helping with reducing celiac disease. And what was funny
Right.
was the progression of the phase 2 trial to phase 3 was halted because although the data showed that the gut healed and improved itself in the human subjects that took it, because they didn't pass a gluten challenge test, the researchers deemed it useless. So basically, they wanted a drug that would allow you to eat
Now,
gluten without response.
that's just not going to happen.
And exactly. So, I mean, this compound, which I've seen personally great benefit from, but reducing that intestinal permeability, the closure, the gut junctions, was just not progress to phase 3 because the endpoint was a little bit, in my view, ridiculous, that you were looking for a
Yeah, that
compound
does sound a bit, because surely if it's healing the gut, anybody that is celiac should know that they have to avoid gluten. But their gut's damaged from gluten intake, so surely fixing the gut is fixing the problem. That is a bit mad,
yeah,
isn't it?
and then you're in my view, if you had a trace exposure then to gluten, so like what I said about that time with the trace exposure at 16 weeks into being gluten free, I had another small trace exposure then in January 2024 from a takeaway meal. And I put down the lack of pain in that exposure to diligently using that, and that my belly still swelled out massively. And again, I put it on social media, but luckily I didn't have any of like the pain or brain fog that came from it. My gut basically just swelled from the inflammation, but it didn't really induce the same mass hysteria immune response that I'd had during the summer. Which, I mean, I can take having to fast for 2 days to let that inflammation settle in my gut versus being in bed for 2 days absolutely rode off with stomach pains and sandpaper feeling. So it just goes to show that when we have these like compounds available, they're in clinical use, that the endpoint for reaching the public to speak can be quite far off what would be deemed useful against a perfect clinical outcome that's take this drug and you can eat gluten forever, which is never going to happen.
How do you find oral BPC 157? I've just started that yesterday because I've been feeling a bit overtrained for about 6 or 7 weeks now. I've been using tirzepatide GLP-1 for since last summer. I've lost about 15 kilo or something with it. I got to the point where even on that, I probably haven't taken enough diet breaks throughout that period, because I've got to the point now where even on it, I've stayed on a low dose. I've stayed on like no more than 2 milligrams. And I've got to the point now where I'm absolutely fighting for any fat loss at all. And that's like 1,600 calories some days and everything, and losing about a third of a pound a week. But it's also affecting my training as well. So I had to have like a deload week about 5 weeks ago. This is my second one in 5 weeks, basically. Because the minute I'm starting training again, I think it's just months and months and months of low calories and low nutrients, obviously, that my recovery, I seem to be in a bit of a recovery hole. So I've noticed that my elbows feel a bit tendinitis and this shoulder does. I've got a long injury that I done MMA years and years and years ago. That's how I had to give up martial arts. I've got 2 bulging discs in my neck, so when I start to get tired and run down, it's like the nerves sort of re-inflame again. So I just feel a bit beat up. So I started it yesterday just while I'm deloading, just to try and help sort of repair that elbow and things. But how effective do you find it orally? I've ran it once for 2 weeks in the same scenario, just as to help sort of recover from a deload. But what's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so oral BPC 157, there used to be a myth that it was useless. And then you only had to look at the animal research of BPC 157, and they gave it to rats in drinking water. So the oral efficacy of it was clearly shown from the animal data models. I think where people looked at like injectable BPC 157, when you inject something that's water based, which is what most peptides are, they'll diffuse into circulation. So they'll rapidly move through your tissues into your bloodstream. and it goes all over your body. Whereas if you orally ingest BPC in a capsule, it targets your gut first, and then it's absorbed into your bloodstream from the gut. We make BPC 157 naturally within our stomach, so it's derived from stomach acids or stomach juices.
Yeah.
And we produce it in our stomach to offset ulcers forming from the harsh acidity of our stomach. So we produce BPC 157, stimulates blood vessel growth to our stomach to keep repairing our stomach lining. Orally, for injuries, I'm not a huge fan of it because you're going to repair the gut first and foremost with whatever dose you take, and then some of it's going to go into systemic circulation. That's not to say it hasn't got efficacy for total body injuries in terms like tendons and ligaments, but it's just having to go through the stomach to the intestine and then into the bloodstream, whereas when it's an aqueous solution injected, it goes straight into your bloodstream and systemically distributed. But it can be the most useful thing, like you've probably seen. And how it really works is it increases blood flow or blood vessel creation, angiogenesis, and then it also helps your body to produce more growth hormone receptors, which then helps you to repair tissues like tendons and ligaments that have poor blood flow already, to bring more nutrients to repair them.
Yeah, so that was kind of my thought on it as well, that when taken orally, it does first and foremost repair the gut, and then you just get a spillover. But that was just the easiest thing for me to pick up yesterday when I was feeling a bit, well, I've been feeling a bit like that for weeks, but it just popped into my head yesterday. I'll just go and grab it. As I say, it's no something that...
No, I was going to say, I've taken a big interest then in sort of like when we have fat loss stalling, like what you've seen there. What I became really interested in over the last like 15 months is the mitochondria, and how the mitochondria play into how we lose fats, how we produce energy, how we produce our neurotransmitters for our brain health. That when we start to see issues of like stubborn fat loss, where our fat loss rate is slowing down, like with like functional medicine or naturopathy, you ask like, well, what's going on? And like fat loss is simple thermodynamics, like calories in, calories out. But we've sort of created that calories in, calories out methodology as a simple way to understand the process, that if you don't take in as much energy as required, you produce that energy. But that energy, when you work your way down to like a biochemical level, is electrons from the breaking down of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and nitrogen with protein. But those electrons are then what feed into the mitochondria to produce ATP. So if we have an issue where our energy balance is off, this is sort of where when people are arguing that it is about calories in versus calories out, that in theory, yes, but you can't expect someone to go below like 1,000 calories if they're like a 90-kilogram male and train intensely and everything else, have a good sex life, good cognition, work performance, etc. That you then start questioning, well, if I'm not losing weight and everything hormonally is relatively okay in terms of testosterone, thyroid hormone, gut health to speak, is there an issue with the mitochondria where there's high levels of oxidative stress, so the mitochondria aren't working as efficiently as possible? Are they having a deficit in thyroid hormone like exposure or testosterone production, because the mitochondria are what make your testosterone in your testicle and adrenal gland? And do you have nutrient issues where you don't have enough carnitine to help transport fats into the mitochondria? All these things that, like, when I got really fascinated into mitochondrial health and restoring my gut function, the change in my body composition. So like I said, I retired from bodybuilding in 2022, diagnosed celiac March 23, clean everything up by like September 23 with my gut and everything else. And it was only at that point that my body composition started to change without much effort, to be honest, in that like I was eating 3,500 calories and my body was recomping and losing fat, gaining strength. And this is all at a normal testosterone level. That it started to bring in this like question in my head of like, what if I went back and competed and took what I'd learned all years competing with what I know now about the mitochondria? And that was where I got fascinated in the peptides towards mitochondrial health, and even the GLPs of Well, what happens if you increase the number of mitochondria you have? And what happens if you increase their efficiency? Now you have all these powerhouses that are producing their energy but able to burn fat for you. And then they make your neurotransmitters for your cognitive health. Last year's bodybuilding prep, if I was to even call it that, I ended up dieting that whole prep on no lower than 3,500 calories.
I would be a water buffalo on that. Like, I've always had a stubborn metabolism, and as I say, when I read that at uni about my mum passing on the diabetic gene, I was like, that makes so much sense, because any time I've been really lean in the past, I've had that really suffer. But this might be an interesting conversation. This might actually help me a lot, because I might ask you. But, so what's happened with me is last year, well, at the tail end of the last year of my undergrad, obviously I'm a mature student, I'm like 40, so I was 40 at the time, sorry. So that was my last year of my undergrad. I was up early, PTing in the morning, then I was trying to get to uni during the day. I've obviously got a family, wife, kids, whatever, and then I was out late again at night, and I was that stressed in my last year that I thought, I'm not going to manage all this. So I've got a few coping mechanisms when it comes to stress. Overeat on the wrong things. I'm a bit too partial to alcohol from time to time. Again, normally when I'm stressed I'll do that, but I also like to really train. I like to run for miles. So I was training to the point where I wasn't recovering. I was eating terrible because I was always on the move. I was drinking probably more than I should have been because I was constantly stressed, and I somehow still managed to get through it all. But my body composition was terrible. I was like big, chunky, but far too much body fat, huge amounts of body fat. So we were on holiday, was it last summer, and I actually broke out in psoriasis. And obviously knowing what I know about nutrition and things, I thought, right, there's something obviously going on with my blood glucose or my gut or whatever. So when I got home, took my blood glucose, my fasting blood glucose, and it was high, it was really high. So I decided then, I thought, right, I'm going to use a GLP-1, try and get my weight down as much as possible. And I worked a treat up until about January. From summer to January with sort of intermittent diet breaks, but as I say, I've always had a stubborn metabolism anyway, so I automatically used it to take in extremely low calories. I got to the point where I was like, right, every time I was dipping into a calorie, like that low calories, I was going to push lower and lower and lower to get any fat loss. So then that meant my recovery was like plummeting, my training was plummeting. So I've kind of been in this, since January, been in this cycle of getting a few good weeks training under my belt, crashing and burning. A few weeks good training under my belt, crashing and burning. So it was just the other week that I thought, right, I moved back to maintenance. So I've really upped my protein higher than I normally have it. I've really upped it to try and get a trend, because I think I've lost a wee bit of muscle tissue as well. I must have done with a low calorie diet. The aim is now to try and get my metabolism moving again and regain a bit of tissue before I go back and try and get rid of the rest of it. But it's weird the way, like, when it comes to diet and the psychology follows you, because any time in the past I've had to really suffer. But when you use a GLP-1, it takes that suffering away, and it makes it effortless. Until I got to the point where it's just like, still effortless to diet, but as you say, my recovery, I wasn't able to train hard, and I'm getting a couple of weeks training and I'm crashing and burning. So constantly trying to fight that fatigue for next to no weight loss. So I'm now thinking about, right, what could I do next? What could I do at this point to get my metabolism moving, get some recomp on the go, and basically still improve my body composition, still keep the fat stores coming down whilst regaining some muscle and getting my metabolism moving. So what was your approach to that?
I completely think that's what happened there. Is your mitochondria are screaming at you. Like when I look back at my during my 20s, during like, I wouldn't say the height of my bodybuilding career, but when I was competing every year after year in my like mid to late 20s, yeah, it wasn't uncommon that I'd have to get down to low calories to get like insanely like sub 4% body fat. And then last year when I started looking at the mitochondria, looking back historically, I was doing everything as worse as possible to make them scream at me that we are having to try and keep you alive, so I'm not too focused on burning body fat. And so when you start thinking about how the dynamics of fat loss occur and then the mitochondria's role, when you start to see fat loss slow down, they're basically your mitochondria make your energy, and they do that by burning glucose and fatty acid. When you start to see fat loss slow down, even though it is calories in versus calories out, that's all determined by the energetics of the mitochondria. So when you get to that point and you're having to push calories really, really low when it makes no sense, they've gotten to the point where they're basically stressed and they're telling you, we can't do what you're asking us to do. And the reason being is the mitochondria, ironically, produce a lot of our oxidants of our body. So when they make energy, they create radicals that damage our cells. And then we use antioxidants to put out those fires that the mitochondria make. So if we're overtraining, we're not getting in enough nutrients. So the mitochondria love magnesium. So if we're not getting in enough magnesium to help them function properly, your production of ATP diminishes. And again, the less energy then that you're manufacturing, the less intense you can train or the less activity you want to do because your brain starts suffering from that. Like when I pieced that all together last year, 2022 was the first time I had a coach, Aaron Casey, for my training. And Aaron put the thought in my head to stop at 1 rep in reserve or even 2 reps in reserve during that prep. And I remember saying to him, when you go way out of it, that this isn't going to work. I was all into, high intensity exercise, drop sets, beat the logbook, grinding out like those extra reps. And he explained to me, when you do that, you're only putting more stress on your nervous system, and then your nervous system needs the extra nutrition to recover, or your sleep suffers, and then you want to overeat based on that lack of recovery. When he changed my training to that, I thought, why all throughout my 20s was I obsessed with training to like maximum failure? So when I went into last year's prep, I done the whole thing of 1 rep in reserve training. And that again was served of, you're just doing enough work in the gym to stimulate the muscle mass. So you're still lifting intensity, but you're never going near that rep where you're having to grind it out. So for the whole bodybuilding prep or fat loss phase, you want to call it, my strength stayed pretty much plateaued, and that I held on to my strength all throughout that prep. Which meant I held on to the muscle mass, which has its own metabolic capabilities to help you burn calories at rest because of your increased metabolic rate. And then just giving the mitochondria a bit of nurturing with certain peptides. So there's a well-known one called MOTS-c, and it's a mitochondrial open reading frame, which basically is a section of mitochondrial RNA that tells your body to produce more mitochondria, and then it makes your mitochondria more efficient at utilizing glucose. So it's been investigated as a diabetic treatment, type 2 diabetic treatment. So if you're now able to make more mitochondria in your body, this is where it becomes a double-edged sword, in that if you increase the number of mitochondria in your body, you're able to make more energy in theory. The more factories you make, the more pollution in theory that can come with it. So now you have to have radicals, exactly. So you have to have a robust system in that you're monitoring like your antioxidant intake, whether it's nutrition, supplements, and that you're in a relatively low stress environment. Once that happens and you have the mitochondria on your side making energy, you're keeping your body that free radical production isn't damaging your body, then you can start doing other things of, well, now I've increased the number of mitochondria that I have. How can I make them more efficient in terms of like the electron usage? How can I get them to spin more electrons through to pump out more ATP? And as like far-fetched science as it is, like last year, I've done all the documentation of the prep showing this is what I've done. These are the certain peptides that I considered for my own personal use, and gave the education on, well, I understand my daily nutrition, my antioxidant intake, my blood work, all the markers of oxidative stress, that with obviously the risk of increasing the mitochondria, if all those risks are, from my perspective, mitigated, all you're going to see is benefits of higher energy production, higher rates of lipolysis, and allowing you to eat more food because you're feeding the mitochondria more nutrients to produce energy. That by building up my calories, like what you're probably going to do now in terms of metabolism.
Yeah, that's what we embark on anyway.
That's it. Because I spend so much time after fixing my gut and optimizing the mitochondria at a high calorie level, so I got my calories up to about 4,000. when I went from 4,000 down to 3,500, that was a shift in energy balance that my body had in theory got used to as a set point, and that was in theory a deficit. And all I had to do was standardize my daily activity. So I done 20 minutes cardio in the morning and 10,000 steps per day. So that stayed standard. I only trained 4 days per week. I took 3 full rest days. So I gave those rest days towards recovery, whether it was active walks, stretching, massage, sauna, all these different recovery modalities to help offload some of the bodily stress of training. And like there's pictures of me down at 4% body fat with what like is considered the gold standard of conditioning bodybuilding, like striated glute muscles, lower back with Christmas tree or whatever, still eating that high level of calories of 3,500. And even if that every couple of days I went back to, again, I had a nutrition coach, Callum Raystrick. I just handed everything back to him from an accountability perspective. And from his point of view, every 4 days, based on how I was training, he was actually giving me maintenance refeeds back up to 4,500 calories of like baseline 350 to 380 carbs up to 500, 600 refeeds. And that was because of how efficient. Yeah, how efficient my metabolism was and that energy balance and glycogen synthesis and everything else. That now I'm starting to see that when we have these issues of stubborn fat loss, yeah, in theory, there's a lot of things that can play into it. Like if the person is psychologically sound in that they are being very truthful, that they're not overeating and cheating, which is a whole other avenue, and they're being strict in their accountability of what they are actually eating, well, then you have to take a step back, like I said, of that calories in, calories out model is still sound, but at the very core level, it's the mitochondria. And if they're not burning fatty acids for energy, well, then you have to figure out what's the insult that's making them not happy. Is it that you're not eating enough like micronutrients like magnesium? Is it that you're not sleeping well enough? So again, they're put under stress with lack of rest, lack of growth hormone production, lack of cholesterol, which is what they use to make your hormones, or lack of nutrients for your neurotransmitters. Like what you said about being, really interested in the link between like nutrition and disease. In the published medical literature, or even the scientific literature as a whole, they're now starting to move into a lot of disease being driven by mitochondrial dysfunction.
Yeah.
So
mitochondrial dysfunction.
If you've got heart disease or high blood pressure, kidney disease, in theory, is it that the mitochondria become dysfunctional, creating oxidative stress, and then that spilled over into the organ systems? That if we can keep these little guys happy, we can keep up with the fires they're making to make our energy. There's a lot of benefits to be gained from keeping those guys relatively happy. I think what I hope to see in the next 3 to 4 years is those who like bashed calories in, calories out, that on one side the thermodynamics is correct, but you then have to then view that our system is quite complex and it's not just a calories.
Yeah, that's how. I've always thought that when people bang the calorie drum, I'm like, yeah, it's true, but only to a point. Like, I've been working with a few people just now. Women are really bad for that, not being able to get through their head that they need to bump their calories up. And I'm working with a few people just now using GLP-1s, and I'm like, that's great, you can take your calories that low, but it won't work forever. At some point, you're going to need to learn how to maintain and start feeding your body and nourishing it. You can't just go there calorie-wise, and stay there forever without you finding some negative consequences along the way, i.e. sleep, recovery, whatever. All the things there that you mentioned were affected, have been affected the past few weeks for me. My sleep's not been great. It has been the past few nights actually, it's been back better, but my sleep's not been great. My ability to lose fat is just, and that's with a GLP-1. So it just goes to show that it's not calories in versus calories out at that point, because I'm managing to keep my calories really low, and I'm fighting for about a third of a pound a week, and I've still got plenty of body fat to go. So, and there's definitely other things going on. But when you start speaking to some people about sort of building the metabolism and things, they just shake their head in disbelief.
Yeah, I mean, even then, it come like with your sleep, it could be something as simple, like I said, with magnesium deficiency. You use magnesium obviously for energy production at the mitochondria, but you also use magnesium to metabolize estrogen and to metabolize dopamine. So when you don't have enough magnesium in your system, your sleep is going to be interrupted because of you have this adrenaline or dopamine response occurring. And it's like the RDA for magnesium nutritionally is 300 to 400 milligrams. But when you look at scientific research that was done on intensely trained athletes on magnesium intake, it's between 5 to 10 milligrams per kilogram that's recommended. And most intense trained athletes need that 10 milligrams per kilogram as a baseline. They might actually need more. And there's a useful scientific paper or article called Magnesium and Stress, the Vicious Cycle. It shows that when you get stressed with cortisol, you use magnesium to blunt that stress response. So now you have less magnesium for getting rid of dopamine, you have less magnesium for energy production. It's just this knock-on cascade that, yeah, like you said, you can explain to someone that the thermodynamics balance still matters. But then if you're not getting enough magnesium into your nutrition, you might champion that you're able to eat 500 calories. But perhaps, what if you ate your 500 calories and you took in supplemental magnesium? If it has to be a supplement instead of food, in theory, so be it. But now you're giving the body the substrates or the micronutrients that it's looking for to help your internal biology. I'm open like in the next 3 to 4 years, like what we've seen now with a slow, steady moving approach with GLPs being introduced mainstream, that people start thinking about the underlying biochemistry than just the top surface level of, oh, I just don't eat and I lose fat.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
you know, the semaglutide clinical trials for fat loss clearly proved that on one side, yeah, if you blunt people's appetites, they'll lose up to 60% of their body weight over 2 years. But the scary reality is, unless they understand those habits and routines and how to maintain the nutrition, maintain mental control of their appetite, whether that is gut health, genetics, psychologically induced from childhood, etc., or it can be interior, what they're trying to look at again, epigenetics, where you influence your appetite from your epigenetics, inherited from your parents through generations. Unless you have that understanding of limiting the food intake after you take the GLP away and that its effect on your brain for satiety or feeling full, in those semaglutide trials, we've seen 60% or 2/3 of the participants regain pretty much close to 2/3 of the body weight again that they'd lost.
Right. I've actually put out videos about that on my Instagram. The step trials, the semaglutide trials, the lifestyle intervention was very, very basic. None of these things, they're great tools, but without the lifestyle factors being dialed in, as you say, then they're not going to work when you remove them. Like, I've also said to people as well that I genuinely think calorie counting is the worst way to go when you're using a GLP-1, because people overweight for overeating nutritious food. They're overweight because they overindulge in hyperpalatable, like ultra processed food, whatever you want to call it. But they've got an issue with overindulging. So if they use a GLP-1 and just are still indulging, but just on a smaller scale, they're not really teaching themselves anything or feeding their body at cellular level the way you're describing it as well. They're kind of just using it to bring the calories down, and then when they remove it, they'll just start eating in larger portions again, and it'll just be the same old vicious cycle. So it could possibly make yo-yo dieting even worse for certain people. If they're going to use it, they should strip it right back and sort of start from scratch and rebuild all their habits, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, even with the GLPs, looking at some of the metabolic syndrome aspects that can develop from using them, because like you said, they're mini indulging at that point rather than focusing on higher protein intake to preserve that muscle mass. they're now, as much as I hate to put the term on it, they're focused on weight loss instead of fat loss.
Yeah.
And weight loss is a horrible term because weight loss just means you just lose a number on the scale, which is the influence of your body with gravity, basically. So your body mass with gravity. That, like, losing weight to speak doesn't really change things more favorably for your long-term health or for your longevity or your day-to-day function of your body. You're really just losing a number on a scale that can be water, fat, and muscle tissue. Whereas really with the GLP, you're looking to lose fat tissue, which causes all sorts of inflammatory insults and metabolic and hormone imbalances, whilst preserving the good stuff, the muscular protein that you've developed for your skeletal strength, doing training activity, which again helps burn calories. You're doing everything positively then to support the fat loss than just the weight loss. And that it's such a shame that people view this appetite suppression as, I'll just forget to eat, so I'll lose, but it's not the right kind of weight in the end. And then, like you see in the rebound, without the education, can be as bad as where they started from. So I love the fact that we have open education and open accessibility to these compounds. There are quite a lot of other generational compounds now that are coming where they're adding more and more peptides to these large fractionated protein drugs, like you have semaglutide, tirzepatide, retatrutide. You have a whole host of other oral GLPs that are in development. Like, there is this race to try and end obesity and overeating. But I still think that, and this is why I sort of moved away from drug development, you're still not addressing the root cause. You've come up with a problem to the symptoms, or a solution to the symptoms of overeating. So you just stop someone from eating. But it's such a poor thing then to have someone have to rely on chronically taking this drug forever, which, don't get me wrong, certain people potentially genetically might have appetite issues and they might need this support alongside guidance, whether that is personal trainer, nutritionist guidance, or psychological interventions. But as a whole, you are really just switching off the brain from thinking about foods, which then doesn't really get us to a good position of early intervention of dietary control, whether that is, nutritional education to younger generations surrounding food choices, as boring as it can be, feeding into maybe supplementation at an early age from a micronutrient perspective. So if you have a child who might not eat a whole host of fruits and vegetables, whether that is due to preference or due to socioeconomic status where you can't afford it, you might have to supplement to some extent with some of the micronutrients. I'm very interested, like I said, in where we're sort of moving now with this drug development side of things, but the other part of me always holds that level of common sense of, well, what's the root cause of all these problems, that we can't just keep running away.
I've actually touched on that as well in videos in the past, saying, like, as much as I think GLP-1s are a good thing, they don't address the root cause. They can help address the root cause if people approach it in that way. Whereas when there's someone that's this effective at blunting appetite, it's going to be misused by people. It just is. It's fact. People are going to use it for dropping weight quickly for the beach or whatever. But when you're actually speaking about the reasons the UK has an obesity epidemic, then it's not going to put a huge hole in that, I don't think, because there's so many other factors involved: the environment, the socio-economic status. There's so much that needs addressed, that these can maybe help people on a personal level, but overall, I think it's going to be a drop in the ocean personally. But where do you stand on, like, I've got my thoughts on them, and I've spoken about them a lot, so I've had a couple of comments on some of my stuff in the past with GLP-1s from people that I really respect, and one person in particular was saying it's a mechanism of action that's the issue with GLP-1s. He says, mark my words, within 5 years, we're going to have an epidemic of gallbladder and kidney issues. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess what we've done here is like classic drug development. I always laugh at this. We've created a compound, the GLP-1s, as an agonist for the GLP-1 receptor within the gut to make the pancreas more efficient at producing insulin. But then the consequence of it, it interferes then with your ghrelin pathway and your neuropeptide Y production. So all of a sudden now your appetite is suppressed, improving how your pancreas works. But alongside that, then you have then effects back onto the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine, to put it that way, with gastroparesis, so the movement or the initiation of how the stomach contracts itself to churn food, slows down. The release of foods from the sphincter into the small intestine slows down as well. The way I try and explain like digestion of your stomach is that you've got like a dripping tap from your stomach into the small intestine. It's just dripping digested food and gastric juices down into the small intestine, and obviously then it gets brought down the pathway for absorption. If everything slows down there, then it has a knock-on effect back onto the gallbladder, which then is trying to help the liver with fat digestion. There are a lot of people that are putting caution on these things feedback that you might see slowing of bile release, which then potentially could lead to bile crystals forming or gallstones from forming in the gallbladder, which then puts pressure onto the main bile ducts and then also onto the phrenic nerve in your shoulder. I don't have much of an opinion just yet on it because I haven't seen a lot of safety data just yet to say that it's something that can be coming, but like the thyroid toxicity risk that's potentially there from these GLPs interacting at the thyroid from a cancer perspective, I wouldn't discredit that this is something that is coming either. Like with the GLPs, we've developed them for type 2 diabetes, and just like Viagra as a male drug, it was designed to be a blood pressure medication. Same with minoxidil for hair regrowth, that was a blood pressure medication originally. We repurposed these drugs based on what we observe in their effects.
Yeah, it was just that when I've looked into the history, it was just a nice little side effect, was it? The appetite blunting. So now there's a myth on TikTok as well, which I've looked into, but it says that the starting medical dose is 2.5 milligrams, but not to expect too much glycemic control until you hit 5 milligrams. So that is directions for populations, as directions for diabetics. So now there's a myth on TikTok of people saying you can't lose weight on 2.5. That's just a loading dose. You're not on a real dose till you're on 5 milligram. Now, I've used this for most of last year, and some weeks I was only using 1 milligram. I see people on 10 and 50 milligram. Not people I know, but just people on TikTok and things. I seen one woman. She was saying she was on 15 milligram and wasn't getting much appetite suppression. So that is where I'm like, right, what's going on inside if you're taking that amount? If I'm able to run a milligram or two for 6 months and still get benefits from it, quite strong appetite suppressing benefits from it, what is 15 milligram actually doing to your digestive system? And that's kind of where I stand on everything, really. I suppose the devil's in the dosage, but 10 to 15 milligram, I couldn't imagine what people feel like on that, to be honest.
Well, aside from their wallet getting depleted very quickly as well, based on the cost of it. I mean, even like semaglutide, if you look at the BNF or the NICE prescription guidelines, semaglutide actually starts for diabetics at 0.5 milligrams for 4 weeks. It's a really, really low dose, and then it's stepped up in terms of like what's observed in responsive glycemic control. For a normal person without type 2 diabetes, probably 0.5 to 1 milligram, they will see that appetite suppression because we're not looking for the effect of the GLP back onto the pancreas to improve insulin secretion. I have personally trialed GLPs, and one of my funny experiences with it was it killed my appetite, but then because of I'm a little bit different to you, I'm like a carbivore that I can eat 600, 700 grams of carbohydrates every day with my HbA1c staying under 30 and my insulin staying very good. Just from a fuel perspective, that it killed my appetite, and because then I wasn't eating, and then my blood glucose control was already very, very good. There was times I'd be sitting in this office and I'd have a proper, like, very low blood sugar, hypoglycemic attack, where I'd go and check my blood sugar. It's just below 3, 2.93. But then you have no appetite, where you want to eat to get the glycemic index, or like get your blood sugar up again in your body, that I'd have to get like cyclic dextrin or some glucose and basically drink it as a quick way, because mentally I'm like, I don't want to eat this rice or jellies even to get my blood sugar up again.
Yeah.
The other consequences that come from it, they're just looking at the appetite suppression effects.
Yeah, see, that's one thing I decided to do. Like, I've not trained any martial arts for like 10 years, but because that was my background when I was younger, I've always been into like what they call hybrid athlete. Now, I've always been into lifting, but I've always been into running and stuff as well. But when I decided, it's weird that to the tail end of last year, when I was carrying all that weight, I was still fit. It was like, it's mad that you could be fat but fit. I was still able to run a half marathon and things. I was still like aerobically fit. I was still strong. There was obviously stuff going on when I broke out in psoriasis and things. And I wasn't really comfy that heavy anyway, but, so when I decided to use it, I pulled all that from my training. And I've just basically been lifting and walking since, because I knew if I was trying to do all that type of stuff, then I would have hit this wall that I've hit. I would have hit it a lot quicker and a lot faster, because of the energy demands you put on yourself. So the energy demands you put on yourself, you obviously need to feed. But I've always had a stubborn body. Like even last year, being able to go and run half marathons and stuff, and just not an ounce of fat would come off me. I've always been like that, really stubborn. When I started using it, I found the opposite from you. Me, normally, I'll go a bit hypo anyway, and I don't know if this is a genetic thing or just, I don't know, maybe it's genetic, but if I miss meals or start doing, maybe playing about the intermittent fasting or whatever, I'll go hypo quite easily. But when I started using tirzepatide, I was able to like fast. I was able to just move meals. I was able to no eat, and I wasn't getting that roller coaster. I wasn't getting the hypos, the highs and lows of blood glucose at all. I was able to transition to a low carb diet pretty much like that. All these things in the past, appetite regulation, and it is when you read the sort of the gene getting passed on from type 2 diabetes. That's what I've said to my mum. It's your fault. It's all sort of consequences of that. Really, I've always had a really high appetite, always had a high BMI for my height. Always really struggled to get lean. I've been lean, but I've really struggled. And when I started using that, it's like it just balanced everything out. But as you say, the calories in, calories out model only takes you so far. So, and I knew that anyway. I knew I was gonna hit the wall with it eventually. But I had something else on my mind there. In terms of GLP-1, I can't remember. It's gone. What ones have you used? Just semaglutide?
No, I've tried tirzepatide, and then I was given a sample of retatrutide. Retatrutide, in terms of like appetite suppression, tirzepatide, in my view, has stronger appetite suppression effects in how you rank them. I think when you look at retatrutide and the ghrelin peptide aspect that's put onto it, or glucagon, I should say, sorry, the glucagon aspect helps to improve your sort of metabolic flexibility and how you mobilize and utilize fats. With that in mind, what I found was retatrutide had very good appetite suppression effects, and then they wore off. It came to a point where my metabolic efficiency, in terms of what my body was looking for from a fuel perspective, was overriding what my brain was trying to be told not to eat. And so I found after a while that 1 milligram, 2 milligrams of retatrutide in the beginning would kill my appetite completely. I could regulate my food intake. After a while, it became difficult to suppress my appetite because my body was basically, the metabolism of my body was being improved, which is why you take these compounds anyway, having a knock-on effect that wasn't actually overriding the ghrelin pathway of appetite suppression. Whereas with tirzepatide, because you have the GLP and the GIP aspect, the GLP-1 is with the appetite suppression, the GIP is helping with fat mobilization, like the glucagon part of retatrutide, but it's not to the same overall extent, but it doesn't have then some of the improvements to your metabolic health, to speak, like your metabolism. So you don't see this want of your body to eat more to fuel it. So tirzepatide, from an appetite perspective, I've seen others who utilize it and never really come to the same roadblock than if they choose to use retatrutide experimentally.
GLP-1s go, what other peptides do you find are extremely beneficial when it comes to fat loss, isolating just fat loss alone?
So I think if we were to look at attenuating fat loss, what we're looking at is two aspects. You've got lipolysis, which is the release of fat out of your fat cells. And then you have free fatty acid oxidation, which is your body using those fats for energy production in the mitochondria. So this is sort of where, when someone doesn't see immediate fat loss, in terms of like they can not eat for a day, so they fast for the full day, and then they figure out, well, I didn't eat at maintenance, I didn't eat anything at all, why didn't I lose 3,000 calories of fat tissue in my body that day? And when we view like fat loss as a dynamic of the release of fatty acids out of our fat cells, the burning of those fatty acids in your mitochondria, and then the restorage of those fatty acids, it gets very complicated over thinking just because you don't eat, you're going to burn fat for energy 100% totality. So if we're going to optimize fat loss, you want to improve lipolysis, which is the burning of fatty acids, the release of fatty acids. And the main thing that we probably look there is a section of a growth hormone called growth hormone fragment. The growth hormone fragment is the end piece of growth hormone that induces the release of fatty acids. So we might look at growth hormone fragments to improve the release of fatty acids. And then you might utilize something like L-carnitine, which is an amino acid, to help bring fat into the mitochondria to burn it. You might look at other peptides interior, like what we talked about, MOTS-c, where you're improving the efficiency of the mitochondria to utilize glucose and improving their number. Or you might look at stuff specifically towards direct lipolysis. Now, it's approved for human use, but it's generally used for lipid dystrophy, which is basically, if we look at HIV patients, they lose body fat from certain areas of their body and then redistribute it to the other parts, normally the abdomen. So there's a peptide, tesamorelin, which will help improve the transport of these fatty acids to reduce the impact of this lipid dystrophy, or the lipid distribution, which is what I was on about, of just because you bring fat into the bloodstream by releasing it from fat cells, it can redistribute through your body. And this is a phenomenon that can happen quite often with generally women, that they lose body fat from a certain area of the body, in terms of the fat cells will reduce in one area, but the fat cells will mobilize and move to another part of the body as well. So what we want to make sure is, when we're releasing the fatty acids, that we have the energy balance to use the fatty acids for energy, and then you have the mitochondria health to burn those fatty acids through fatty acid oxidation. So it's a little more complex that people then think that, okay, I'll take growth hormone frag, I'll take Motzi, I'll take all these things and they'll magically burn fat. They'll magically help me lose body fat. But again, it comes down to if you take growth hormone fragment, which helps you directly release fat into your bloodstream, you'd probably be best doing that in a fasted state, whereby when you release these fatty acids into your bloodstream, you're more likely to use those fatty acids for energy. But that doesn't mean, again, that just because you've released fatty acids out of your own fat cells, as you're eating throughout the day, if you are in that energy surplus, you're going to put new fatty acids and triglycerides into those old fat cells. So just because you've lost fat out of a cell to use it for energy, the total energy balance again comes into the equation that you can then just store fat back into the cells. So using lipolytic agents to help you lose fat from your cells can help, but if you aren't balancing that out with your nutrition, then it's sort of like you're negating the effect of the peptide on your body.
Yeah, so just to sort of simplify all that, for if people are watching through trying to get an idea of what all that means. So the HGH frag would actually help your body's fat cells release fat into the bloodstream to be available to be burnt for energy. The L-carnitine then would pick up that fat from the bloodstream and help it shuttle it into the cell to be used for energy. The MOTS-C, in theory, would improve the mitochondrial function, so that fat that's been taken there would be mobilised as energy, and the tesamorelin would stop it from basically just moving, especially in females, you were saying.
Yeah, well, in theory, the tesamorelin will help with the lipolysis, but it helps to offset that lipid mobilization to an area of the body that you don't want it to occur. And normally what they do with tesamorelin for HIV patients medically is use it for visceral fat on the abdomen, so they'll mobilize that fat with the tesamorelin for energy storage or energy utilization and away from storage. And obviously visceral fat, when we're focusing on fat loss, visceral fat is probably the very first thing you need to be targeting towards improving metabolic health. And then sub-Q fat, subcutaneous fat, whilst it can have a metabolic burden, it can influence your health, it's not to the same detriment as visceral fat. Sub-Q fat is what you sort of want to lose to reveal aesthetically, veins on your skin and maybe a six-pack if there's a layer of sub-Q covering your abdomen. But if you have that deep visceral fat in around your organs, like your stomach, your liver, that's the stuff you want to make sure that your body's mobilizing and losing, because that is what it contributes to morbidity, to death.
Yeah, something I was just thinking about there when you were talking through that. All these peptides, as you said at the start, all these peptides are interesting, but without the sort of foundations and nutrition and training and stuff being there, are probably not going to be that much use at all. And it's almost becoming like, the more I read into it, they're almost becoming like supplements and micronutrients, and like to try and have a balance of everything is like you could end up with a supplement cupboard that's massive, and it's so hard to get a balance of everything to be like. I don't think there is anything such as the 100% optimal human diet. I think it's too hard to achieve because there's that many nutrients to do that many different things. So in terms of like the peptide use, they can help specific outcomes such as fat loss, such as anti-aging, such as performance. For this fat loss scenario, when would you say is the right time to sort of maybe, would you say it's when you're sort of at the point where the stubborn fat loss is starting to happen, but your body's starting to fight back, or would you say to start off with this, and what do you think?
I think for most people, and this is a very generalised statement that could be wrong, but I think for most people, they could probably achieve 10 to 14% body fat relatively easily, to speak, and I'm using the word easily lightly, without any of these like lipolytics or peptides or anything like that. Sure, perhaps a GLP, if there is psychological issues with food intake, those aside, I don't think you need like fat burners to speak until you are getting into maybe a little bit below 10% body fat, where you're aiming for um, a level of body composition that is probably outside the normal population, if you want to put it lightly. In that you have someone who's looking for very defined musculature. If it's someone who's just looking to move from 24% body fat down to 10%, so moving from a place where there's a bit more mass to a more athletic look to speak, I don't think you need these compounds really. Or they might speed things up marginally, but I don't think they're going to be a magic bullet that gets you there any quicker than following the basics of what we talked about, like sleep, nutrition, and the lifestyle and environment. That's where people then see these compounds and think, oh, if I take growth hormone fragment, I'm going to lose fat quicker. To be honest, if everything is set up right and your deficit and your energy balance is all appropriate and everything else is ticked off, yeah, you might see a little bit of a quicker rate of loss, but it's not going to be any quicker than the person beside you who's doing all the basics with you.
Yeah, it's going to be marginal.
And then you have to weigh up, like, what is the cost, the benefit of it, like what you're spending monetarily versus what you get out of it. Don't get me wrong, the mechanism of how they work is absolutely sound, but you're sort of pulling the trigger too early on these things without getting to a position where you've done everything right, you've gotten the most results out of the least amount of variables, and then at that point you start adding in these fancy things that could help you on your journey. I'm just not sold of like saying, if you take like growth hormone frag, you take carnitine, you take whatever else, that you're going to lose fat much quicker than someone else who's doing all the basics, because it'd be
that's what I'm saying, because like when it's broken down the way you explained it almost becomes like a chain. This will mobilise this, then this will do the next bit, this will do the next bit. But without, like, I think a lot of people tend to go for that. They tend to reach for a supplement or a drug before they think about the basics. Like, that chain, as you said, could easily be broken if energy expenditure isn't equated for, sort of thing. If you're taking in too many calories, you will just restore the fat that you've liberated earlier on in the day and burnt through. So the net balance will be nothing. One question before I move on to the sort of other stuff I'm interested to find out about from you is, you mentioned HGH frag. One thing I've always wondered about that is what would even be the upside to using that from just using HGH? Because obviously the frag is just a certain part of the amino acid sequence, so surely if you're using the whole sequence, you're still getting that part of the sequence, so it's still going to do the same job anyway. Is that correct in me thinking that? Or
so if you take human growth hormone over the fragment is just for lipolysis, so it doesn't have any of the proliferation effects of human growth hormone, so it has none of the growth factor element to speak. So if you take real human growth hormone, you're going to get a lot of other mechanisms on top of fat loss. So you're going to get IGF-1 production, which helps your cells to proliferate and grow, both, inside your muscle mass and inside all the other cells of your body, like your organs and everything else. That increased turnover of cells can create oxidative stress. So one of the things of human growth hormone use is, whilst it is anti-aging to speak, it can be aging also, depending on what happens when you produce more cells. It can have knock-on effects, and it'll suppress your own natural production of growth hormone for about 6 to 10 hours. When you take an injection of human growth hormone, it takes about 3 to 4 hours to peak in your system, and then it leaves your system after about 10 to 12 hours. So what that can do then is it can put the brakes on your own natural growth hormone use because of the feedback loop it operates on. And then the other side of it could be, in theory, then, that when you dampen your own natural production of growth hormone, you're missing out on opportunities throughout the day for fat loss, because now you've got a period where you might have low growth hormone until that negative feedback switches off.
So almost swing, you almost get like a peak then a trough. Almost, yeah.
That's it. So with fragment, you are then just getting the end tail of the growth hormone that induces lipolysis without causing any of the rejuvenation aspects of growth hormone. So you do find, I mean, as an aside to this, you will find that there's a lot of anti-aging clinics in the United States where a lot of these peptides are compounded. They can be prescribed, and the prescribing MDs will prefer growth hormone secretagogues, stuff that tells your brain to produce growth hormone naturally, than human growth hormone itself directly. And what they feel there is the feedback loop, the amount of growth hormone that gets secreted with the secretagogues, sort of looking at like the GHRPs or CJC that people have probably heard the names of, that tell your brain to naturally produce growth hormone with an artificial stimulus. So that is a really good question on why would you not just take human growth hormone. And of course, yeah, it has great benefits. If you take human growth hormone, it's prescribed to be taken before sleep. So you wouldn't necessarily take it in the morning before fasted activity, which is like a myth that is often advertised. And that's because that human growth hormone that is taken will take 3 to 4 hours to peak. So if you take it before hopping on a treadmill fasted, it's doing nothing for fat loss during that that treadmill session. But if you use it before bed, it takes 3 to 4 hours to peak in your system. You've gone to sleep, you get deep sleep, natural production of growth hormone. Then your injected growth hormone peaks after 3 to 4 hours, and during that period you're getting all the rejuvenation aspects. You're getting lipolysis during sleep. But like what you've touched on, lipolysis can make our insulin function or sensitivity worse. So if we're chronically having high levels of growth hormone, increasing the amount of fatty acids in your bloodstream, that can make your insulin receptors less efficient.
Yeah, that's one of the growth hormones. Not something I've used extensively because of that. Because of my genetic predisposition to become diabetic, and it makes you acutely insulin resistant. But I'm wondering now, at the age I'm at, should I be using it? But then there's that trade-off. Like, does there become a time when there's like a safe zone dose-wise for that insulin resistance, or is it just going to do that regardless?
In theory, it'll do it regardless. And how I've often viewed growth hormone usage is you almost want to have periods where you take your foot off the gas, that you might use growth hormone for 3 to 4 days per week, and then you take 3 to 4 days break from it. And that way you're not having this chronic elevation of fatty acids in your bloodstream every single night. If you're using it before bed, you're giving yourself an opportunity of releasing fatty acids a few nights per week, maybe using them for energy production whilst at rest, losing that body fat, and then giving yourself a few days break where you're not using it, so you're not long-term affecting your insulin's function. So it's from a replacement perspective. If you do start to see growth hormone level production decline as you age, then supplementing your body with 1 or 2 IUs on the very low end of the production scale will probably serve some level of longevity as opposed to detriment. But it's very hard to say then when you have genetics towards type 2 diabetes, that is that
how
replacement
much
dose like that, is it going to cause a detriment, or is it going to help me overall?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I've kind of always shied away from it. I have used it, but never really properly ever, to be honest. Never really properly where I've been like, right, I've seen XYZ out of it sort of thing. Simply because I knew that I'd done that, and I'm quite wary of that sort of thing. So you kind of segued into the next thing I had written down anyway. You kind of segued into that naturally from the fat loss conversation. But in terms of peptides from an anti-aging and longevity view, which ones would be functional and why, and what purpose would they serve, basically? So
this is where like the conversation changes towards what would be considered like the Khavinson bioregulators. So Professor Khavinson was a very well revered Russian scientist who has isolated and discovered hundreds of short chain peptide molecules. The most well known one from an anti-aging perspective would be epitalon. Epitalon is a short chain peptide that is based off epithalamin that we produce in our brain naturally. Epitalon's main mechanism of action is to produce or increase the production of telomerase. So as we create new cells in our body, our cells divide and we pass on our genetics into that new cell. But with every division of a cell in our body, the genetic chromosomes that have all our genes on them, or all our DNA, they have a protective cap that shortens every time the cell divides. And then eventually what happens when the cell reaches its limit of division, that end cap is at the very end and it becomes frayed, and now the chromosome, which has all your DNA, is now exposed. And quite often our body has a defense mechanism that says, okay, that DNA is now exposed on that chromosome, let's basically tell the cell to die. Otherwise it can in theory turn into a cancerous cell. If we can keep adding bits onto the telomere at the end of your chromosome, protecting them, well then you extend in theory the amount of times that cell can divide healthily. There aren't really specific exact numbers, but in the human trials where they introduced epitalon to Russian subjects, they found that life was extended by about 10 years in those who used epitalon. So it's one of these really interesting molecules that in theory mechanisms of aging come down to the cells divide, and as the cells divide the DNA can get damaged. When the DNA gets damaged, your body's using up its defense systems to repair that DNA, and then that takes up energy demand of our body, which accelerates how we age during our life. That if we can protect our DNA from being damaged and we can keep those ends of the chromosomes for as long as possible, you could add 15, 20 years to your life expectancy because of, at some point, well, in theory you could keep adding to the telomeres chronically, but we don't have that data just yet to suggest, well, these are the dosages you want to take of epitalon, these are all the things you want to do in your environment to protect the DNA. But in theory, there's nothing to say in time that genetically, like all these crazy genetic modifications that are coming from a therapeutic standpoint for humans, that you could influence your telomere lengthen by creating more telomerase from this epitalon peptide or production of it genetically. And that's sort of where we see like biohackers or longevity people looking to try and live for as long as possible from that aspect, or one aspect of our human biology of it, keeping the DNA protected from cell divisions long term. So epitalon is one to look at. Other things, you've got like beauty peptides, if you want to put it that way, like copper peptide, GHK copper peptides, which our body makes naturally. Copper is such a versatile element in our body. It's involved in reducing oxidative stress. It's involved in our iron metabolism. It's involved in free radical quenching. GHK copper peptide can be used topically. It can be used systemically with injectable to improve the amount of copper in our body. It's quite often used in serums for skincare, so you put it onto wrinkles or the skin health themselves to improve collagen deposition to skin. And we've got stuff like matrixyl peptides, so if there's any women or even men listening here who use like high-end skincare products, they're probably putting some type of matrixyl peptide onto their skin daily from an anti-aging perspective. You know, you've got all these top cosmetic companies that will say, oh, exclusive peptide technology inside the skincare. Most of the time it's matrixyls that play off the matrixin peptides in our skin, our body to create firmness and collagen deposition to the skin themselves. What else could we consider longevity wise? I mean, the bioregulators, like I said, from the Covincent side, you have all these organ specific bioregulators, and what that means is basically they isolate these peptides from certain organs and then they act at a DNA level to influence DNA at that organ itself. So an example would be Cartilax would be a bioregulator, and Cartilax is a short chain peptide isolated from the cartilage of animals. When we put it into the body, that short chain peptide acts on the DNA involved with cartilage synthesis in theory and can help to re-stimulate or regenerate cartilage, or so it's purported. So you have all these DNA specific bioregulating peptides. You have stuff like thymogen, which is isolated from the thymus glands of cows, involved in regulating the DNA of our thymus gland to improve immune cells being made. I mean, when you're looking at longevity, what you want to do basically is keep your cells dividing for as long as possible healthily. You want to keep oxidative stress as low as possible so that the cells aren't getting damaged. And then the third part then is, I guess, ensuring that the overall nutrition to the body is sufficient for energy metabolism, so there isn't an energy deficit for the reproduction of our cells. And if we can tick all those boxes, like I said, biohackers, longevity experts who want to live forever, in theory could.
Yeah, so you just kind of you just done it again. You just segued in it. Then the very next thing I was going to ask was, staying on that sort of topic, like you own a supplement company, so what supplements would you say, which is a sort of an easier barrier for entry for people? It's less of a minefield as well, supplementation, than the peptide world. But what supplements would you say are the best supplements for keeping yourself healthy, anti-aging, whatever?
This is always a great question because this is how the company started, from like a transparency perspective. And when someone's like, oh, what's the best supplements I should take? You'd expect someone who has like a business surrounding like supplements and everything else to go, oh yeah, here's a big massive long list of what you should be taking. And I always come back with a question of, well, firstly, what's your current nutrition like and your lifestyle and environment? Where are the deficits in that nutrition? And what potential impact or negative impact is that having onto something like your blood work that you can track? So what impact is it having onto your cholesterol, your kidney filtration, your liver enzymes? Whilst, you know, at the very top, perhaps if someone didn't eat a balanced diet, you'd maybe look at a well-rounded multivitamin, multimineral, so you're getting all these micronutrients and vitamins that may be devoid in your nutrition or may be lacking, or your environment is depleting you of it, so even topping up on vitamin D and K2, that you might not eat green leafy vegetables, you might not get enough sunshine. Maybe you look at stuff that's more specific then to your overall health. Let's say your cholesterol is raised. Do you look at certain supplements that help reduce cholesterol production in your body? Or really look at protecting your LDL from being oxidized. So one of the main formations of plaque or atherosclerotic plaque in our body is foam cell production from oxidized LDL. The LDL gets damaged from oxidative stress, free radicals and whatever in your bloodstream, that vitamin E and vitamin C and CoQ10 are doing their job to protect that LDL from being damaged. So looking at supplements like that, perhaps.
If people were supplementing vitamin E, what dose would you say to go with? Because I've read vitamin E can be quite toxic in high doses.
So this is where education is paramount. Vitamin E is an umbrella term for tocopherols and tocotrienols, and there's 4 of each. Alpha, beta, gamma and delta, to my knowledge, off the top of my head. The 4 tocopherols and 4 tocotrienols work together. The tocotrienols are actually what do the electron donation. They're the guys that stabilize your body, basically. But when you look at vitamin E supplements, it's always either alpha tocopherol or gamma tocopherol. And what you've read in terms of the research is, if you take in a high amount of vitamin E supplement, quite often it's either alpha or gamma. So you're putting one of the 8 very, very high in your body, right, and the other guys aren't. When I was creating our product HeartStack, I put a patented or trademarked ingredient in it called Evnol. And Evnol is red palm tree extract, or red palm fruit tree extract. And what that has is all 8 forms of vitamin E in it. So you're giving the body a balanced profile of the tocopherols and tocotrienols. So yeah, that's a clear example where if someone thinks, I'm going to take a vitamin E supplement because vitamin E protects me against free radicals from the sun, from my nutrition, to go out to a high street store and buy a high 400 vitamin E supplement and they're pushing their alpha or gamma referral level up really, really high, and then the other 7 to speak are going, well, he's gone very, very high. How do we balance out how he's reacting within the body? And like I said, the tocotrienols are what do the actual work. So that's a good example of, when you're making supplements, you want to create them that they're doing their job properly. The person can do the research into the tocotrienols and tocopherols and see that that's probably the better way to take it than a strict vitamin E supplement.
Yeah, that's how a lot of the times it is sort of dubious, just picking up cheap vitamins and cheap, especially minerals as well, like the zinc oxide and stuff. It's practically useless.
And that's it. When we made our multivitamin, we put all the active forms, like B vitamins should be phosphorylated, like pyridoxine HCl is vitamin B6. That's when you take something like Berocca. I don't like using like names of brands, but when you get Berocca tablets and you drink one and all of a sudden you're peeing a luminous yellow, that's the pyridoxine and riboflavin coming out of your body and your urine. You haven't used that vitamin. In order for your body to use B vitamins, they have to be phosphorylated, so your body has to convert them into an active form. So we just went and put the active forms into our vitamin that if you do end up going to the bathroom and it is bright yellow, you've basically just taken in too much B vitamins. Active form B vitamins that your body's utilised, the active form, and you've excreted out the stuff that's not required. Same with the minerals. What the mineral is attached to is normally cheap chelating agents. You want to look for stuff that's attached primarily to amino acids is normally the best safe bet. So magnesium biglycinate, so magnesium attached to 2 glycines, over something like magnesium oxide. Although magnesium oxide can have some use in its absorption in your gut, it doesn't really get the magnesium into your body. It gets it into your gut, and your gut gets hydrated, and that's why it's a laxative. Stuff like iron, even like ferrous fumarate, which is quite often prescribed as an iron supplement, is very harsh in its absorption across the gut. Whereas iron biglycinate, where the iron is attached to 2 glycines, crosses into your bloodstream a lot more gently without the requirement really of vitamin C to help bring it across the gut barrier. That is another great side point of consumer awareness, that people think they go into a supplement store, buy a supplement, think it's going to have a benefit. For some cases it will, and for others they're just wasting money because they've not really taken the time, or they've not been educated perhaps of what is the best thing to buy. And that's why we spend a lot of time on education around our products.
And a lot of time as well, I've said this to people before, is I don't think people realise quite how strong the placebo effect is. That's why it's accounted for in scientific studies. Yeah. Like if people think they're taking a useless form of magnesium, then all of a sudden they're sleeping better. It's pure placebo effect. It's crazy. It's mad.
Same with like fish oil. This is a huge one. For anyone listening here, fish oil quality is one of the main risks when you buy cheap. In terms of like going into a high street supermarket and seeing like a fish oil supplement that's relatively inexpensive. Fish oil, whilst your omega-3 fatty acids, your EPA, DHA and DPA, which is one that is quite often not in products, they have a delicate balance in our body towards our membrane health of our body and keeping our inflammation down. The oxidation of the fish oil is very important. So if the fish oil has been damaged by sunlight, by manufacturing processes, whatever, you're putting something that's already oxidized into your body, which is then a free radical or a source of oxidation for your body to have to clean up. If you're buying fish oils, you really have to be sure that the total oxidation of the oil is less than 26, which is like the cut off, the TOTOX value is what it's called, is less than 26. And ideally you want something that is coming closer to 10 to 12 without breaking the bank budget wise. And that's why, like when I was developing our fish oils, we look for products that have very low total oxidation values. Like we've one product, Omega Pro Plus. It's a chewable fish oil. It basically, in my view, is one of the highest purity forms of omega oil on the market. It's the triglyceride form. So again, with fish oils, it matters whether it's triglyceride or ethyl ester. The triglyceride form is more readily absorbed by your body for utilization. You chew the fish oil, so people, again, when they take fish oil capsules, forget that it's actually a source of nutrition. So chewing the fish oil, make sure that you're starting the digestive process to tell your body fats are coming into the system that need to be digested. And the total oxidation of Omega Pro is around 3 to 5, which is one of the lowest you'll find. And that means to me that when I'm putting a product out like that, that we've done our diligence to ensure high purity and high quality. It's inside a dark tub, so again, as soon as it's made, it's packaged into a tub that's not clear. So again, if you're buying fish oils, unless it says on it, like we have another high strength omega-3 which is higher EPA, we have that in a UV protected tub, in a clear tub. So again, if it's sitting on a retail shelf or it's sitting on someone else's shelf at home, sunlight is being reflected from damaging the oil inside if it was left out in sunlight.
I don't think people realise how fragile the fatty acids are. It's like cooking with olive oil and things like that. You're just damaging the fat before you even consume it. And as you say, it's already toxic when you're taking it in. Another supplement, but not in bodybuilding terms, is like I've seen a lot of different stuff about creatine recently being good for brain health, mitochondrial health, and I actually seen something last week about it helped treat insomnia and chronic insomniac. So could you touch on some sort of basics about creatine, but in a non-bodybuilding sense?
Yeah, I mean, creatine, to touch on the strength aspect quickly, it helps with creatine phosphate, which plays into your energy production. So it's good for strength. But like you've seen there at the research, creatine can act as a metal donor. So when we're talking about methylation, it goes back to the genetics talk. It's very good at being able to control our epigenetics of switching on and off different genes. And what they're starting to see now potentially is in neurodegenerative diseases or even cognitive deficits from high impact to the brain. So concussions or a traumatic brain injury, that the body will flood creatine to that traumatic brain injury or that brain damage in order to try and repair it with, it's changing energy dynamics. With the current body of evidence, it's still misunderstood exactly if creatine supplementation in high dosages will have a positive effect onto traumatic brain injury. There are quite a lot of anecdotal reports of very high creatine doses, like 40-50 grams every few hours, 2 TBIs, improving the outcome of the brain health afterwards. How our body transports creatine is with creatine kinases, these creatine enzymes that shuttle the creatine across. That it's very hard to say what is happening with a traumatic brain injury. Is there an increase in creatine kinase production to facilitate all this creatine going to repair the tissue or help with energy turnover? That I wouldn't be surprised, like what we spoke about with GLPs and shifts in medicine that way, that creatine becomes a mainstream medicine to speak of. If someone comes in with a severe concussion or a severe traumatic brain injury from an accident, that they're giving high amounts of creatine monohydrate intravenously to help with brain health or brain recovery afterwards. It's one of the reasons when people often ask, we have an electrolyte product, why I put just 1 gram of creatine monohydrate into the electrolyte product. It was exactly for that reason, because of creatine helping with, in theory, helping with brain energy metabolism, that very small dose, as opposed to being a saturating or loading dose for muscle health. But yeah, it's one of these things that I think over the next 5 years, there's quite a few sports universities. I know I think the Metropolitan University of Manchester is looking at research on creatine and cognitive health. So there's
it's very interesting, but it's not something that surprises me. It's like what I was saying to you about the whole reason I want to do podcasts like this, is sort of being able to bridge the gap between the sports and performance world and everyday people. It's like, and people that aren't so much into that sort of side of things, because a lot of stuff in bro science, so to speak, gets picked up and people know it works. 20 years later, the science sort of backs it. But just with a basic understanding of how creatine works at a cellular level, like, it doesn't surprise me that it has all these extra benefits as well, because everything is metabolism, is it? Everything.
Yeah. I mean, there even years ago you had a lot of companies trying to bank in on creatine research, all these fancy forms of creatine, like creatine ethyl esters, creatine nitrates, different chelating things.
The alkaline and
crealkaline.
the carb shells.
And all that in the end really came down to creatine monohydrate come out on top as king. That creatine's solubility into water and its transport can be improved by a finer particle size. You'll find like micro ionized creatine powders, but that's more so to try and offset some of the digestive distress that thicker creatine powders produced, or I guess non-fine creatine particles produced, where they irritate people's stomachs.
Yeah, my digestion's always fine with creatine, but I know that research and the literature says that it's intracellular water you hold, but I definitely hold sub-Q water. Well, I do with everything. I'm just like, store fat easily, water buffalo easily, just automatically. I get moon face off of creatine and things, so... Thank you very much, mate. That was fun. That was honestly a great conversation. Do you have sort of anything else before we sort of wrap up?
No, I think that's been a nice, about an hour and a half conversation. I haven't lost too many people along the way. That hopefully it's given them an insight into a few things around like stubborn fats, fat loss as an overall, mitochondria. Don't basically take supplements for their face value. Do your research into the different forms. Do you actually need the supplement or not, and just the overall opportunity to get that education out.
Brilliant. Dean, thank you very much for coming on. It's really much appreciated, as I say, just at the very start of trying to get this started properly. So I really appreciate everybody's help to come on, and that was a great conversation. I learnt a lot. I'm about to go and look at upgrading my mitochondria when I leave this conversation. Would you be able to do me a favour and just stay on for a couple of minutes to make sure that the episode's uploaded, and then we can part ways. Thank you very much again, and if anybody has followed on YouTube or whatever, please like, subscribe, whatever, and I will be back soon. Thank you very much, and we shall see you later.